Hugh Roland Page of the University of Notre Dame. His vita is long and very impressive. Dr. Page holds 2 master's degrees from the General Theological Seminary in New York, a doctorate in ministry from the Graduate Theological Foundation, and a master's and doctorate in Near Eastern languages and civilizations from Harvard University. He joined the Notre Dame faculty in 1992 and quickly rose through the ranks to professor of theology and professor of Africana studies. Along the way, he has received a presidential award for service to the university, and he has served as Notre Dame's associate provost and as well as its dean of first-year studies. Dr. Page's publications are too numerous to list, but I want to point out one book, Black Scholars Matter: Visions, Struggles, and Hopes in Africana Biblical Studies. This is a volume that Dr. Page co-edited and published last year in response to the events of 2020. Also last year, Dr. Page was named to a new role at Notre Dame. He is currently advisor to the president and the inaugural vice president for institutional transformation. When I heard the news, I wrote Dr. Page to congratulate him, and I said, "Love your title. VP for Transformation? That's very Holy Cross." And he said to me, "I thought so too." Dr. Page is indeed for Holy Cross, and his presentation today will focus on the pillars of Holy Cross education: mind, heart, family, zeal, hope. He will explore how these elements can give shape and definition to the initiatives of diversity, equity, and inclusion taking place on Holy Cross campuses and campuses around the country. His presentation is titled Building Transformative Communities of Learning in the Holy Cross Tradition. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Page.
Greetings. I'm delighted to be with you today, albeit virtually. First, let me express my gratitude to Dr. Richard Bouch, Interim Director of the Holy Cross Institute, for his very gracious invitation to be part of this morning's proceedings. I would also like to thank Dr. Fuentes and the larger St. Edward's community for your warm virtual welcome, Mr. A.J. Valverde for his technical support, and Dr. Jimenez Herrera for her wonderful thought-provoking presentation a few moments ago. I had initially thought to utilize PowerPoint slides to supplement my remarks, but have decided instead to rely, like an old school preacher, exclusively on the power of the voice and the virtue of brevity. To advance the conversation already begun this morning, I'd like to spend a few moments thinking with you about how we constitute, in conscious and intentional ways, communities of learning that instantiate those values at the heart of the Holy Cross tradition. Such communities, whether large, small, residential, impromptu, or within classrooms, have the capacity to change lives in extraordinary ways. They also help ensure that pedagogy and knowledge acquisition become pathways to intellectually grounded and compassionate action in service to the larger world. Such formation at the high school and collegiate levels is much needed today, given the stressors and myriad disruptions that are part and parcel of emerging post-pandemic life. We are, thankfully, much more aware of the fragile nature of our social connections and the importance of both maintaining and strengthening them. Our appreciation of the interdependent webs of mutuality in which we are embedded continues to deepen. We realize in ways unprecedented that our collective well-being is dependent on the quality of care we extend to one another and that our unique features and commonly shared elements are gifts of grace from our divine artisan that we must learn to understand and to cherish. As a result, we are witnessing remarkable levels of commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and justice-related initiatives on college and university campuses around the country. This is true at community colleges, liberal arts institutions, and universities that focus on research, teaching, or both in equal measure. There is much about which to be enthusiastic here. Institutions that engage in critical reflection on what it means to be a place of student-centered teaching and deep learning, particularly at a moment in time when both are so urgently needed, cannot avoid asking probing questions about educational access, about enrollment strategies, about resource allocation, about faculty recruitment and retention, about belonging, and the relationship of these elements to institutional identity. All are critical for the success of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. For such work to be both sustainable and impactful, it is increasingly crucial that such work be mission-aligned, woven into long-term strategic planning, and part of a constellation of efforts geared toward growth and change. For Holy Cross institutions, such work can be creatively shaped through engagement of the pillars of Holy Cross education: mind, heart, family, zeal, and hope. My remarks will address how these elements can contribute to an action-oriented matrix focused on establishing and nurturing transformative communities of learning, and brought into meaningful discussion with best practices in undergraduate education and DEI work. So what is the context in which we work? It's an exciting time to be involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Looking around the country, interest in and commitment to DEI work is substantial. National organizations are providing both guidance and resources for such efforts throughout higher education, and a number of institutions around the country have created chief diversity officer or equivalent roles to provide leadership for such efforts. To be frank, a few challenges persist. For example, approaches to the work vary. Consensus is oftentimes lacking on best practices. Training for DEI professionals is at times inconsistent. Assessment criteria are not uniform. Resourcing in many instances is insufficient. And there is, at times, lots of wishful thinking rather than tough reckoning. Nonetheless, opportunities do abound. At the national level, there is increased resolve for truth-telling and responsiveness to demands for transformational, data-driven, intersectional, and justice-driven change. There are efforts to align DEI initiatives with institutional mission, to increase professional training for those involved in this work, and growing awareness that cross-institutional collaboration will be needed to mitigate gross inequities throughout American higher education. There's also a special role for Holy Cross institutions to play, particularly when diversity, equity, and inclusion work is set within what I have termed a dynamic transformational matrix. When we work synergistically with peers to address systemic problems that impact those historically underrepresented and minoritized in the academy, and when we situate ourselves as ethically minded facilitators of difficult conversations about race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and other aspects of the lives of those we are called to educate and to empower. Specifically, as institutions committed to providing an all-inclusive education, we must keep at the forefront of our consciousness Blessed Basil Moreau's admonition that, quote, "An education that is complete is one in which the hands and heart are engaged as much as the mind." This suggests that we, as clerics, as educators, as administrators, must create learning environments that are welcoming and that evoke compassion and love. dialects of the soul's ineffable language. Fluency in these idioms enables us to meld thought, prayer, and action. It also helps us create an ethos in which there are no outsiders, because everyone is family. Creating welcoming and transformative learning ecosystems in our current environment can honestly be challenging. There are often fears and misunderstanding about those dimensions most essential for education that equips young people to be mature persons of faith and responsible citizens in our national and international communities. At their best, colleges and universities are microcosms of the larger world where one encounters a broad cross-section of its cultures, its people, and its ideas. They are dynamic facilitators for exploration and conversation, sanctuaries where human encounter and querying of complex and at times seemingly intractable problems are engaged. In such places, lively debate is essential, and the formation, spiritual and intellectual, one receives from personal encounters with peers is as important as what one receives through formal coursework. This can only take place if great care is taken to create an intentional community of faculty, staff, and students with sufficient disciplinary expertise and experiential breadth to become a true learning ensemble, where teaching and learning are mutual and complementary activities. Thinking about this from a Holy Cross perspective, such intentional communities consist of a melange of peoples fully absorbed in deep, sustained, and integrative learning that engages the mind and heart, that elicits zeal and hope, and that generates immutable bonds of kinship. In other words, that creates family. Within such a setting, it is important to affirm those aspirations students hold dear as their educational journeys begin. For example, to learn, to become people of faith and conscience, and to prepare for meaningful and productive lives as citizens of the world. As Catholic institutions that embody the Holy Cross charism, it is also important to affirm unequivocally our identity as places where those divinely bestowed attributes that make us who we are the gifts that animate the intellectual, spiritual, and other pursuits central to institutional mission. We all have important roles to play. Our lives and our livelihoods, our comings and our goings, and our destinies are intertwined, inextricably linked to one another. What affects any one of us impacts, however subtly, all of us. We are linked to and responsible for one another's lives. So how do we align our efforts as Holy Cross institutions with best practices around the country in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion work? A commitment to embody the Holy Cross charism in creating vibrant and transformational learning communities and aligning ourselves with efforts to promote equity and justice are complementary rather than competing goods. We are called, therefore, to ensure that all committed to our care are treated with respect. We're called to honor those experiences which have shaped them and to be forthright in defending their dignity. We do these things because we are not a community of strangers, but because we belong, in fact, to one another. Therefore, we have a duty to be aware of those best practices in higher education shown to promote the establishment and creation of inclusive and welcoming environments. One set of 16 standards has been put forward by the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. They offer a reasonable starting point for thinking about how to create and sustain learning communities that are open, accessible, ethical, and representative of the social complexity and cultural richness of our world. They are as follows. First, to develop a comprehensive definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Second, to embed equity, inclusion, and diversity elements as institutional imperatives. Third, to plan, catalyze, facilitate, and evaluate processes of institutional change. Fourth, to collaborate in the removal of embedded practices and policies that serve as obstacles to access and success of those in minoritized populations. Fifth, to promote inclusive excellence across our educational curricula. Sixth, to advocate for inclusive excellence in all areas of intellectual activity and mission-related endeavors. Seventh, to prioritize the use of scholarship and evidence-based practices in our work. Eighth, to collaborate in developing infrastructure for work related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Ninth, to find an appropriate balance between centralization and decentralization in our efforts. 10th, to plan, build, and assess institutional equity, diversity, and inclusion capacity. 11th, to assess institutional climate periodically. 12th, to develop protocols in response to hate-based incidents. 13th, quote, to facilitate and assess efforts to mentor, educate, and respond to campus activism, end quote. 14th, to establish appropriate accountability measures. 15th, to ensure that our efforts comply with the law. And 16th, that we engage in this work ethically. Friends, while these standards are intended primarily to inform the work of those occupying roles that have primary stewardship for institution-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, they're also meaningful touchstones for the work of everyone committed to creating and nurturing intentional communities in which learning in service to justice and transformational change is a priority. They are, in a real sense, guideposts for institutions in hopeful movement toward becoming the very best versions of themselves. Read, interpreted, and applied within Holy Cross institutions, they help us develop specific action items with measurable outcomes that make it possible for us to assess impact while continuing to ground our work on the pillars of mind, heart, zeal, family, and hope, and ensuring that kindness, compassion, and love remain crucial North Stars for success. So what are our next steps in this journey of becoming? Colleges and universities are, as we all know, strange and wonderful places. Those within the Catholic fold are unabashed in their embrace of what might be called the mystery of becoming, the process by which grace helps guide individual growth and institutional evolution in times both predictable and fraught. Ours is a time of uncertainty and of disruption. The need is perhaps greater than at any time in the history of American higher education for institutions capable of being gathering places for those willing to and courageous enough to engage in transformational encounters, experiences that are certain to produce the next generation of change agents for our world. Such places will, of necessity, be vibrant, at times incredibly messy, and maybe even a bit noisy. This is what we should expect of those crucibles where tomorrow's prophets, tomorrow's reformers, and tomorrow's social leaders are born. For them to be maximally effective, they will also need to reflect the world they hope to serve. The work of stewarding universities through tempestuous times will not, as we all know, be easy. Forces opposed for whatever reason to work of this kind will be martial. So I leave you this morning with a question to ponder in the days ahead. It is one that increasingly occupies my waking hours and my dreams. It is as follows. In an environment where resistance to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is increasing. How does one continue to make a context-specific case for such work within and outside of Holy Cross settings, consistent with American values, consistent with civic virtues, and consistent with the moral imperatives that help create a just and beloved community? Friends, my opinion is that our ability to build and sustain transformative learning communities in the Holy Cross tradition will depend on our ability to engage and propose solutions to this query now and in the years to come. As a member of one such community, I look forward to joining you in this important intellectual and indeed spiritual endeavor. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Page. Simply remarkable. Comments, questions for Dr. Page? Please raise your hand.
That list of 15 items that are necessary in order to effectively do this across Holy Cross communities, will you be publishing something on that? Because I think it's a very helpful list for all of us.
Sure, I'm happy to. Those 16 standards
Okay.
have been proposed by the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and they're readily available
Okay.
on the NADHE website. But I think the opportunity to think about how they intersect with the values that animate education in the Holy Cross tradition, I think that's work that we all would do well to undertake, to think about how to contextualize those, what they mean in settings like St. Edward's and at Notre Dame, at Stonehill and elsewhere. And, I think that is what makes this sort of translational work so incredibly exciting.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Hello, my name is Maureen Schwenninger, and I'm a Master's of Divinity student at Notre Dame. I'm a double domer, yes, and I want to thank you, Dr. Page, for your service in the first year of studies and your representation here today. I really appreciated the question that you left us with, and I was thinking, even before you offered it, that your comments were really making an excellent case for engagement of DEI work in a Holy Cross space. And I appreciate that, that contribution to the conversation. There was a helpful image I heard from Dr. Ernest Morel at Notre Dame last year, this concept of desegregating our vision of heaven. He offered that comment at a Catholic conference talk, and something that's really stuck with me: desegregating our vision of heaven. Not something that would speak to maybe all people in the DEI space, but something that really contributed to the Catholic conversation around this topic. So I was curious if you had any other images or ideas that you found helpful in Holy Cross spaces or in Catholic spaces in which we find ourselves along the lines of what Dr. Morel offered with that comment.
Yeah, I don't have anything as compelling or creative as desegregating our vision of heaven, which I think is, wow, that's really powerful. What I would say, though, is that, I've often thought of colleges and universities as places that prepare the next generation or subsequent generations of individuals that are willing to think outside of the box, who somehow will not see education as a commodity to be bought, sold, and bartered. And specifically at Catholic institutions, places that become communities where compassionate intellectualism is fostered, where compassionate intellectuals are created in service to the world. And by compassionate intellectuals, I mean people of conscience who see the education that they've received as a gift to be given to the larger world without cost. And that, for me, continues to be, the most powerful image that I have for animating the work that I do, not just in the DEI space, but in general within the classroom, and as I think about what it means to be formed intellectually and spiritually at a Catholic university.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Eifler from University of Portland. So struck by that phrase, compassionate intellectuals, and your earlier reference to it's our diversity that reflects our full humanity as people made in the image and likeness of a God who loves us. My local archbishop just became the 34th to issue a pastoral statement, pretty much negating the experiences of LGBTQ individuals. And I wonder about the tightrope that those of us in ministry to people whose lived experiences have just been negated, how we might do that as compassionate intellectuals without jeopardizing our ability to stay where we are to continue our ministry. It just seems like a bottomless pit sometimes.
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult tightrope to walk. And I think that in some ways, it makes it incredibly important for us to define what the role of colleges and universities, even within religious traditions, should be. And they have to be places that are safe. They have to be spaces that are affirming of identity and those markers of distinction that make us fully human. And we have to ensure that there's sanctuaries where learning can take place, where critical engagement of difficult issues can occur, and where reasoned debate about issues within and outside of the ecclesiastical realm can be engaged. I know that it's difficult, incredibly difficult, but I think if we're able to affirm that our colleges and universities within the Catholic tradition are places where that kind of conversation needs to take place, then they can have a leavening effect on parishes and other diocesan and archdiocesan structures that may yield change over the long term as we think about those encounters. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also a realist. And, I recognize how painful the experience can be for those who are marginalized within either educational spaces or ecclesiastical spaces because of who they are. And so I think our responsibility for compassionate care and to stand in solidarity with all those who feel marginalized is incredibly important.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your sterling presentation, Doctor. It was very informative and very moving. You mentioned uncertainty and disruption as realities in the country right now. And if you could say a few more words about how what you're proposing and helping us understand fits within the American values, it would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, I think I never thought at my age that I would live to see a time in our civic life where we were so incredibly divided. After having lived through, as a very young person, I won't tell you how old I was when the 1963 March on Washington took place, or, when Dr. King was assassinated. But, I can say that I thought, and I think my parents and grandparents thought, that by this point in our history, we would have found ways to instantiate that dream of becoming a truly beloved community. Unfortunately, we've got a lot more work to do. And I think fluctuations in our economy and challenges on the global landscape, geopolitical changes, and I think the perception of lack that we have among many of our populations and subpopulations in the United States has led to a really volatile set of circumstances. And to a great extent, I think colleges and universities, especially within the Holy Cross tradition, are called to educate young people and adult learners who will be equipped to go out into the community and sow seeds of reconciliation. And that, that's not an easy task to do. In part, it means that we have to create communities, learning communities that reflect all of the complexity that we see in the larger world, and bring representatives of these various groups together for conversation, to build relationships, and hopefully to generate a kind of palpable hope from their own ability to build linkages across difference that will resonate with the larger society, and that they can model once they receive their degrees and go out into the world. So, I think that this is a long-term process. I think it's, I've often said it's taken us several hundred years to create the kinds of gross inequities in terms of educational access and injustice. And it will probably take us multiple generations to undo the harm that we've seen result from those injustices. But again, I think the great thing about institutions of higher learning is that they have a mandate to be safe spaces to wrestle with really difficult issues. And as long as we stay true to that, and as long as Catholic institutions in the Holy Cross tradition continue to use those pillars as touchstones for the work that we do, I think there's reason to have unbounded hope about what can occur. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Page. We are in your debt. You've moved us forward this morning considerably in our thinking, our minds and our hearts. So we really thank you. And we look forward to more conversation and more of that good work that we'll be doing together. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.